Welcome, everybody. This is the 10th in our series on the subject of the hinge of history and what's happening. And we'll have one on Tuesday, May 14th, on stability in an age of disruption, a governance type session. So we're very glad to have had this. We've had our session earlier today, and now we'll have it here. And chairing it is Gopi, and she is the deputy director of our sister institution, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And I'm very distinguished with her because she and I wrote a book together, along with John Chauvin and Matthew Gunn, on how to reform the Social Security and healthcare system. If they paid any attention to us, Gopi, the country would be much better off, right? So Gopi, take on.
All right, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wanted to welcome everyone to this event. As Secretary Shultz said, this was the 10th in the series of Governance in an Emerging World, and today's session focused on emerging technology in the U.S. economy. We had a lot of great presentations and discussion on a series of several different topics. And we're going to go through each of those topics that were discussed today. Each presenter is sitting next to me, and they're going to have about 5 minutes to summarize some of the highlights that came out of their session. And then we're going to turn it over to the audience and have hopefully continue the conversation for the rest of the time. So I'll start with Erik Brynjolfsson, who had a lot to say about how machine learning can transform the labor market and sort of what policies we need to be thinking about in order to aid that transformation.
Well, thanks, Gopi, and thanks Secretary Shultz and Jim Timble and Hoover Institution for inviting me here. It was a really lively day we had today, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion with the other panelists here and hearing all of your questions. Let me start by picking up on some of the things that John Taylor said at lunch, where he was talking about some of the ways that productivity has risen and fallen again, and what's behind that. And there are a lot of drivers, but I want to connect it to some of the changes that are happening in technology and machine learning, and how that in turn also affects the labor market. And in a way, on the productivity side, it's a bit of a puzzle or a paradox, because many people, including me, see just remarkable things happening in these core technologies. Machines that are beginning to, learn how to drive themselves, that can see as well or better than humans, where you can talk to them and the machine will talk back to you, and you're not hallucinating. This is a real conversation you're having with the machine, something that would have been science fiction a few years ago. Yet at the same time, as John has shown, and as we can all see when we look at the data, productivity actually has been kind of dismal in the past decade or so. It was much better in the 90s and early 2000s. And there have been other periods where it did well as also. So what's going on here? On one hand, eye-popping technologies, yet disappointing productivity growth. And I think part of the answer is that it takes a while for technology to translate into performance. And the reason for that is that you need to do a lot of restructuring and re-engineering. And that's part of the research I presented this morning. We looked at how machine learning was able to do more and more tasks at human level or even superhuman level. The ImageNet competition that Fei-Fei Li here at Stanford helped organize showed that just over the past 10 years, machines went from being really quite bad, maybe 70% performance on that metric, to 98, 99% performance, while humans are at about 95% performance. So they were much worse and now then equal and now better than humans. Similarly, on many other kinds of tasks, I won't go through the litany of them, but there are many other things that humans continue to do better. We're still better at creativity and at interpersonal connections, empathy, coaching, connecting with other people, persuading, selling, negotiating, caring. And so there's a set of tasks that humans are better at, a set that machines are better at. What we did was we went through and systematically classified every task in the economy into those different categories and ranked it as to how well machine learning could do it. We did this by first coming up with a rubric of criteria for when machine learning was likely to be successful, when there's a lot of data available, when there's quick feedback, a set of other criteria. And believe it or not, there's a data set of the tasks that are done in the US economy. It's called ONET, and it takes all of the occupations, and with each occupation, it lists what you need to do that occupation. If you're a bus driver or a primary school teacher or a radiologist, what do you need to do? For a radiologist, it turns out there are 27 distinct tasks, and for each of those 27 distinct tasks, we ranked how well a machine was able to do it. Some of them, like reading medical images, can now be done very well by machines. Other things that radiologists do, like meeting and counseling patients, machine learning is not very good at that, at least not currently. And so what we found was that in almost every case, or I should say in every case, it was impossible for machine learning to do everything that the human could do. There are always parts of each job that humans could do better, at least with current technology. At the same time, for the vast majority of jobs, there were significant portions that could now be done by machines. So it was not an all or nothing in any occupation. And because of this, the lesson we took away was that rather than seeing mass automation of certain occupations, what instead we would see is mass restructuring, re-engineering. Practically every job was going to have to be re-engineered as machines did more of those tasks and humans did other parts of tasks. And that requires entrepreneurs, managers, policymakers to think about how we will reorganize the workforce. And coming back to my original point about the productivity lag, that re-engineering, that redesign takes much longer than simply plugging in a piece of software. It requires people to develop new skills and rethink the whole way that they produce goods and services, the way they do retailing, the way they do healthcare, the way they do manufacturing. That's not an easy task, and it could take not just years, but even decades to do that kind of reinvention of the economy. We are right now in the early stages of that grand restructuring. I foresee a lot more restructuring coming along, but it will be depending at this point not so much on inventing new technologies, but rather on inventing new organizations and reskilling the workforce. So let me leave it at that, but I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the conversation.
Thanks. So we next heard from Dedicin Ghosh, who had a different angle about machine learning and kind of described a lot of the some perils and some negatives about machine learning. Why don't you give us a little summary?
Sure. Well, thank you, Gopi, and just to reiterate, Eric, thank you, Jim and Secretary Shultz for inviting me. So we're here to talk about the emerging opportunities and threats in the world, and what better place to start than the industry that really defines the medium for communication that we all use and know today, the internet, and more specifically, the internet companies. And as we think about how the internet has evolved over the past 30 years, of course, we have all heard the narrative about how and the science of how the internet was started as a place for public good, as a place for conversation, and essentially, as we have built technology in computing and storage over the past 30 years for sure, but even starting before that, as it reached a particular threshold and as new mathematical foundations came to the fore over the past 20 years, there's been a commercialization of the internet in a manner that has enabled certain companies to achieve business models that have enabled them to really overtake this market and put a stranglehold on it. And part of my research really builds off of an idea that one of the ideas that Eric just shared, which is that one of the things that machine learning models cannot do, as well as humans, is care. They're not as good as humans are at caring. And how does that really reflect itself in the context of consumer internet companies? Well, there is a reason that, that when we think about Facebook or Google or Amazon, they're pushing all of the vast majority of their funding in research and development into artificial intelligence. It's because it holds so much economic opportunity for them. But when we think about the ways that machine learning models are trained and eventually evolve, there are significant risks in how they can be implemented in the real world to diagnose diseases or to differentiate people who deserve a loan or don't deserve a loan, or figure out who should, which neighborhoods should be more subject to police surveillance, or to determine which particular individual Facebook users should be subject to a particular ad or ad campaign. It's machine learning models that do all of these things, and more particularly artificial intelligence in certain respects. The fact is that as we think about how to train machine learning models using training data, and as machine learning models carry some of the inferences from that training data into their ongoing development and refinement, there is significant bias that can occur. Bias that, for sure, can lead to harmful disparate impact in areas, industries, markets that have strong civil rights protection, for example, housing and employment, but also, more critically, I believe, in areas that don't have civil rights protection. So, for example, shuffling us into filter bubbles and subjecting us to a particular side of the debate. It's a form of discrimination, of course. All machine learning models discriminate. That's what they are built to do. But my question is that harmful or not? I'd contend that it actually is harmful in another sense. It's not harmful in the sense that that our civil rights are being breached as far as the United States has defined them, but rather that if we're only subject to one side of the debate, or if we're consistently being shuffled out from certain economic opportunities, and this is consistently happening to certain marginalized populations, whether it's by race or by gender or some other demographic metric, then it's corrosive to society in the long run. I think we'll get into it a little bit more as we get on, but there are certain things that we can do to push back on this. And right now, this industry of consumer internet companies that do use machine learning models and artificial intelligence to define our information and media ecosystem, define what we see, are largely not subject to regulation in the United States. But throughout history, as industries have engaged in free markets, essentially, whether it's in electricity or oil or telecommunications, they have reached a point where they were committing harms against the consumer and were regulated. And I think we've come to that point with regard to this industry as well. There should be a conversation around what kinds of public policies we should really consider in the way forward. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So we next heard from John Taylor at lunch about productivity and some other topics. So why don't I turn it over to you?
I was waiting to be at the end of the line, if that's okay. So I addressed the issue, as the other panelists, about technology and the economy, and I thought it would be useful to focus on productivity, because really that's how the technology and investment affects people. Technology delivers higher productivity if it's working well. Productivity, of course, is just a measure of how much goods and services a person produces on average in an economy. And over time, progress is basically due to higher productivity. We're each producing a little more than we were last year and 10 years ago and 50 years ago. And that also explains, for the most part, why different countries are richer than others, why other countries are poor. Poor countries in Africa are poor, arithmetically speaking, because their productivity is so low. So I thought translating the technology into productivity was the way to go. If you look at productivity in the United States, it has its ups and downs, as Eric was mentioning. It came down in the late 60s and 70s. It went up in the 80s and 90s. It came down the last 15 years, and maybe it's picking up again. We're looking at that carefully. And when you look at that, you see certain factors that are important, and certainly technology is an important part of that, because technology allows people to be more productive, to produce more with better machines, better technology than they did before. But also investment makes a difference. The more firms are investing, the more capital each worker has to work with, and therefore the more productive a worker is. So these ups and downs are caused partly by changes in technology, but they're also caused by public policy. In fact, if you look at that trend, or up and down in the US economy, you can see different policies, maybe more regulatory policy in the 70s, maybe less regulatory policy in the 80s, maybe more again in the 2015 period, maybe a little less now. So that explains a lot. But what I think is important, and you think about this measure of progress, is you don't try to strangle the technology. And that's what I get worried about a little bit, because there are concerns about the technology. There's privacy, there's other things that we're discussing. But if we try to squeeze out the gains from the technology, we're all going to lose. And I'll give examples. There's so much that people in poor countries can benefit from the internet, learning how to rotate crops, learning how to borrow, learning their cell phones are connected to the financial system. It's a new world because of this. And we don't want to prevent them from benefiting from it. So that's an example where there's so much more to gain. In the last 15 years, about 1 billion people have come out of poverty around the world. Let's continue with that. The world will be a much better place if we don't try to squish it. And then right here in the US, there's the potentially gains from more use of internet. Education, which I'm involved in, we could do much better with K-12 education, for example, I believe, if there was more use of technology so that young kids can learn no matter where they are in the United States. California, I mentioned this today, has the highest poverty rate in America. It's unbelievable when you say it. Cost of living is higher here. That's one of the reasons. One of the richest states. California has one of the poorest K-12 education systems. It's not as good as Texas, both border states. So there's a lot that could be done, and I think technology is one way to do it. And whatever we do to deal with the real problems, let's not throw everything out, because it's a tremendous benefit and gain to people.
Thank you, John. So we next heard about the California community colleges who took a tremendous effort at sort of building up skills for the 21st century workforce. Vaughn, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So let me frame the workforce dilemma from a story, a conversation I had with a CEO of an AI company when I was meeting with the Boston Federal Reserve. So he actually talked about how selling AI into a company started getting pushback. And this is the story that he told. He said his AI was being sold into a company to help with the call center. And of course, everybody benefit in the first wave, right? Customers had a shorter wait time. The company was happy. Customers were happy. Everybody was happy. Everybody was fine. But then came the second wave of the impact on the workforce. And that was when the company realized, hey, we now understand how to answer so many of these customer questions. We can get rid of the entire call center, right? Elimination of the call center. And that's when the CEO was starting to get pushback from his customers. The HR people had not recognized that this was going to happen to this occupation, so had not planned any transition, had not invested in any skilling or reskilling of folks. And so I really want to express appreciation to Jim Timby and Secretary Shultz for putting the spotlight on this issue of workforce and workforce development. And if you watch any of the videos from Davos or World Economic Forum or the IMF, when we discuss the impact of technology and the velocity of change and how it impacts workers, we are all challenged to keep up with the rate of change. And so the skilling, reskilling, upskilling discussion becomes much more front and center. And I would put out there that we need a new norm. Our traditional norm has been one of having education on the front end, front-loaded. So, hey, by your 20s, your early 20s, you retain that inoculation, that one-time inoculation through your education and training, and hopefully it lasts you for the rest of your life. But the economy, and as I say that, you realize how ridiculous that sounds, because the economy is one of rapid evolutions, especially to these technologies. And so we really need the norm of one of booster shots, right? Get your education and training booster shot constantly, which means the infrastructure for adults to get those booster shots needs to evolve equally. And so and that is one of the reasons why the community colleges have come more into the front and center of discussion, because as an affordable and accessible way of getting education, more is being expected of the community college tier of education, especially the programs referred in community colleges as career technical education. For many of us who were educated through the traditional pathway of the 4-year, maybe the liberal arts core, we may not have as much familiarity with career technical education. So let me just give you an example of occupation in this area. So let's say you were driving home after this event and you got into a car accident. Everyone who touches you, from the medical responders in the emergency medical responders in the ambulance to the people who check you in, get all your stats, take your x-rays, et cetera, until the doctor touches you, and then all the way until you exit the hospital, they are all trained through career technical education in what is called the middle skill credential. So these are occupations trained with more than a high school degree, but less than a 4-year degree. So they're your associate's degrees, your certificates and credentials, and your industry valued credentials. So there's an equal world of these middle skill occupations that are short, that are equal in size to the occupations that require a bachelor's and above in order to get in. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion on the workforce implication as all these technologies roll out.
Great. So the final discussion of today was about the migration challenge, is what it was titled, but I would call it maybe migration challenge and opportunities. So if we could hear a little bit about that.
Are there any immigrants in this room here? I suspect there are more than a few, and some who are second, third, fourth generation. But I was talking earlier this afternoon about how in the 19th century in this country and the 18th century, we were afraid of the Germans. And the Germans couldn't fit in. I think Ben Franklin said they can't fit into this country any more than they can change their complexion. I never thought of Germans as being particularly swarthy and difficult to integrate, and I suspect many of you in this room probably have German ancestors, and Shultz sounds like a German name to me. So, but you're very, very lucky here at Stanford and Hoover to have a great public servant like George Shultz.
Start of World War II, I had a German-American boot sergeant.
You did.
And he called me out, Schultz went out to sea.
Well, I'm reminded a little bit, and, telling these stories and loosening up a little bit about migration is so critical. And I had a great exchange with the economists on the panel, telling them the economics is easy. It's not hard to figure out that migrants are highly self-selected. They're very talented people. You know what the unemployment rate is among illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants? There is no unemployment. These are people who are working. And if you look at those who are in these skill ranges that you were talking about, how many of those people who touch you each step along the way would be an immigrant? So I think, look, whether you're looking at productivity or any aspect of the economics of immigration and comparing it with technology, the human factor, the importance of people in any society is absolutely critical. With all due respect to my colleagues who are focused on artificial intelligence, and they agreed with me that it's not going to be the robots that are going to be changing the baby's diapers. It's not going to be the robots who are taking care of the elderly. You still need people. You still need humans across the skill spectrum, whether it's unskilled or highly skilled. I mean, here we are in Stanford and Silicon Valley. Are there any immigrants working in Silicon Valley? I mean, the source of human capital, one of the great strengths of this society, bringing in the highly skilled and talented people. And I think, for the economists or international economists in the room, this is going to be a critical element in maintaining our competitive advantage in the 21st century. The more open societies, the more open economies, those are the ones that are really going to flourish as we move forward. And, I can't say what the average age is in here, but when you think about immigration and support for immigration and the diversity that we have in our society, I look at my children. I have 3 lovely girls, and it's just hard for me to imagine that they're going to turn inward and want to close off this society to the kind of dynamism and diversity that immigration brings. So I think there may be people in the room who would disagree with this, but immigration is a source of economic strength for our society. But one of the biggest takeaways from our discussion earlier today, and one way you can remember this for future reference, is people are not shirts. You can't bring people in and simply ignore their status, ignore their rights. And that's what we've been doing for decades in this country. And the result is that we have a very large undocumented population. And that's bad for our society, it's bad for our polity, it's bad for our democracy. So we have to deal with this issue of status, and that's going to be a big one. It's going to be politically very, very difficult to do. But rights are key. If you want to manage migration, you can't fudge this. I think it would be a very bad idea, you can quote me on this, to go back to a bracero program like we had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, a guest worker program. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary worker. That's another way of thinking about this. People come, they put down roots, they have families, they have connections, they grow into the society. And if you look at the number of mixed status families in this country now, where you've got some in the family who are here legally, the children often, and the parents are here illegally. I mean, we've got to fix that. We can't continue down that path. But as strong as the economics arguments are, and the fact that we are having a rapidly aging society, although the United States, we still have more youth and dynamism than most societies out there, but we're getting old, and we're going to need the manpower. We're going to need the immigrants and the services that they will provide for us going forward. So just to conclude, I'm reminded of, it's a truism to say that this country is a nation of immigrants. We're built by and large by immigrants, and I think Franklin Roosevelt, when he was addressing the daughters of the American Revolution, started his address by saying, "My fellow immigrants," and reminding them the Roosevelts were in New Amsterdam before it became New York. So we are very much an immigrant nation, an immigrant society. We've got to go back to that and to that kind of narrative. And as hard as the politics are, Professor Taylor and I were talking about this earlier, if we can go back to the basics and looking at how our society was built, we can do it. We can reform our immigration laws, and I'm happy to have an open discussion with you about that after this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So you can see that there were a lot of interesting topics discussed earlier today. I think we are in an unprecedented era of changing technology, changing demographics, and how both of those forces combine and help us think about what our solutions going forward is of utmost importance. With that, I'd like to turn it over to audience questions, and I see one question right here in the front.
Microphone.
There's a microphone coming. And just one more thing is I want to make sure that we have questions from the audience rather than statements. So,
thank you. Yes, I have a question, but first I want to thank Eric for the work he did on explaining the relationship between the tax instance and growth at Davos. I think you accomplished more in 20 seconds than the people who wrote the books that you cited. And on that note, is the retraining need at the top? Because there's been a lot of slack in the unemployment rate, as has been proven recently. And the party line for the last 2 decades is we just need to train the workers. But there's a lot of evidence that it might be that people do not understand the relationship between the tax and transfer instance and productivity and growth.
Right. So it's not an either or. I think one of the great things is that as we're seeing as the economy is running a bit hotter, we have lower unemployment. A lot of people, including me, I think, have been surprised at the ability of the labor force unemployment to keep going down and more people being drawn into the workforce. And that has done a lot, beginning to do something now to raise wages. At the same time, it's also true that already we're seeing some tasks that machines can do better and other tasks, as was mentioned, that only humans can do, whether it's changing diapers or doing creative work or interpersonal skills. So there's a shift that is happening and that will accelerate in the next 10, 20 years from routine kinds of repetitive tasks to more unstructured kinds of tasks. And that will require new kinds of education, new kinds of skills. So we want to do both. Absolutely, I think it's great to do what we can to keep unemployment low and have lots of people participating in the workforce. I think that was what you're getting at. But also have the reskilling. And ultimately, it's this combination of technology, the right policies, the right skills, and full unemployment that will lead to economic growth and productivity growth.
I'd like to add to that.
Yes.
So it's not just the technical skills that are changing, but also what Eric had brought up earlier in today's session was that the current jobs are all getting transformed and morphed. So let me just give a provocation. So what if, in the 10-year future, the algorithm is your new middle management, right? That's not too hard to fathom, given where things are in terms of Uber and Lyft setting up algorithms and determining who does what. So let's say that gets more sophisticated. What does that mean? Well, algorithms can only read data sets. So that means for you to be considered for the next role, next project, you're going to have an online profile, a reputation. So what are you going to do now to start building up your credentials, your portfolio, your ratings of how people perceive you? What is to demonstrate your influence and your networks? Because that is what the algorithm can read. So I think when you start thinking ahead at the impact of technology and how it restructures really organizations and how we do work, it's fairly profound. And the work that has to be done to make us, to evolve us, and to be relevant to the workforce is going to be quite extraordinary.
Question back there.
Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate the fact that the presentation was focused on emerging technology and its implications on the US economy. That's the way the panel is presented and the various perspectives represented here. My question is, could you comment in the context of governance what the implication of these trends are on governance as this whole series of symposiums are intended to address? How do the factors that you have outlined from the work that each one of you has presented so far get reflected as a challenge in governing not only in the US, but in the new world? Clearly, technology had an implication on the elections, not only in the last round of the US presidential elections, but also in the previous two rounds presidential elections.
Is there someone who'd like to take a first crack at that?
Someone new?
I'm happy to. I think we can. One of the things that we were talking about today is framing this, or starting with let's go back to that industry we were talking about, the consumer internet industry, and thinking about some of the negative externalities that it has pushed on the public. I think those negative externalities include certainly what I wrote about in this paper, the spread of discrimination at a systemic level, as well as the spread of disinformation and election interference, as you alluded to, and many other negative externalities. Professor Taylor mentioned privacy and security. These are all things that have been foisted on, let's say, American consumers, and they're negative externalities in the sense that Facebook didn't intend them, and yet they harm democratic process, or they harm a consumer's autonomy. And so, if we're thinking about the technologies that define the new economy, from artificial intelligence to the internet to other industries, I think it's our job to analyze, first of all, of course, to recognize the economic good, the economic gain that we have from all of this blooming of new technology and growth, but also recognize that they're introducing these new challenges. And if we start there, then I think we then have to ask, well, how are these negative externalities actually coming about? And I think that I would contend that they're coming about because of the way that this industry works. Right now in the United States, Silicon Valley internet companies operate in essentially a free market, a commercial zone of very limited regulation, or you could even just say no regulation, really. And that's enabled them to almost grow toward the sunlight like plants growing toward the sunlight without any sort of barrier, which is all fair and fine until and unless they're implicating public interests, like elections. And in that case, I think we then have to take a very hard look at the economic logic of this industry and derive why that economic logic is forcing these negative externalities. And I would say that it's because, in many ways, the interests of internet companies are aligned with the interests of Russian disinformation operators, or purveyors of hate speech, or ad campaigns that pursue discriminatory tactics. Because for the internet companies, the goal is really to engage the consumer. And for these nefarious actors, the goal is, again, to engage the consumer and persuade the individual or the citizen or the voter to take a particular action. And until and unless we understand that economic logic and break it down and break this alignment between the company and these nefarious actors, I think it's very difficult to really address a situation like the disinformation problem. And so we were talking today a little bit about abstracting out some of the common themes of the business model behind the consumer internet. And I'd suggest that it's really focused on really engaging platforms that are owned by companies that engage in anti-competitive behavior. The unchecked collection of data on consumers, and all toward creation of behavioral profiles, and the ongoing development of algorithms that are very sophisticated and make decisions on our behalf without our full understanding. And so a logical response would be to consider a regulatory regime, a new governance regime that would introduce better rights for the consumer in each of those three areas, so that you can continue to allow companies to try to become big, but try to instill better market competition, so that companies can't get engaged in monopoly leveraging or anti-competitive behavior. Don't say that companies cannot collect information, but give consumers the full transparency and knowledge of what's happening, so that they can make a more actionable decision about whether they actually want to share their information with a third party or with an internet company. And finally, give consumers a far better understanding of how machine learning models at least work, or at least are executed or applied in the information and media ecosystem, so that we can start to have a healthier information universe in this country.
Would anyone like to? Yeah, John?
So I just want to answer the question about governance. It depends so much on the area. So this is more like antitrust, pro-competition policy. But what we teach, and I think it's part of policy, is you have to have the specific reason. Is there an externality that needs to be dealt with? Is there a specific lack of competition? So I think it requires much more specificity. I think another example is international. I mean, it does affect international governance. I'm very interested in international monetary system, financial system, and now capital can move so quickly. It's just like it's one global market, and so that means central banks' actions are really, it's like one monetary system, and that changes things dramatically. So what type of financial system should you have internationally in that circumstance? We're just beginning to work on that, but so the main thing is it depends on the area, the policy, and the level of government. There's also big implications at state and local governments, like much more things that can be done where you're really in touch directly with the individuals, with the people. So that's a local government issue. So there's much more things you can do there too.
All right, let's go right here.
I have a question, and that is more directed, I think, to Mr. Ghosh. That would be that, again, going back into the inherent built-in discrimination. I attended a talk here at Stanford a while back, and they said that there were certain things in the algorithms of various companies when they, get resumes and things like that, and certain things are built in, like, especially age discrimination, or even the discrimination based on perhaps gender. And so, but it's all in the algorithm, so it's kind of no one really knows. So do you have any solutions for that or any suggestions?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on in that analysis. Learning models are in this respect, for recruiting and employment, are essentially commercial. They're developed by for-profit companies for that company's profit, and that's how they're engineered. So the more effectively they can get to the decision on behalf of their company, the better for their bottom line. And so machine learning models are built to discriminate and they tend, without the right set of standards around how you design a training data set, without setting the right kinds of rules around the organic growth that your learning model can participate in, this type of bias can absolutely happen, where either you take a historical example of bias and it perpetuates because it's in the training data set, and the training data set is not representative or doesn't take discriminatory or discrimination out of it, essentially. I think just to be brief, there are a few things you can do. First of all, you can impose better transparency into the inputs that go into these algorithms, as well as better transparency into how they, for example, you can implement a public interest API to determine whether the outputs given a representative sample of inputs is fair. If it's not fair, then you can, in other words, if you find some existence of disparate impact against a protected class, like an underrepresented minority, for example, then first of all, that needs to be detected by auditing, so you can implement some kind of commercial audit or industrial auditing on these kinds of companies and back that up with governmental regulation or with private rights of action or with attorneys general, state attorneys general having some authority. And finally, I think some of these issues are outside of where we already have civil rights law. And so we really need to start thinking about how we're going to protect ourselves against bias in areas outside of just the narrow situations around employment and housing, and other places where we have protection from the Fair Housing Act, for example.
I think Eric wants to.
Let me just build on that. This is a very serious concern, and one of the dangers is that these algorithms can replicate and scale up a little bit of bias and apply it broadly. But I also want to keep it in perspective. We have to remember humans are biased. In fact, the data comes from humans. One of the main reasons that these machines, algorithms, can often be biased or discriminatory is that they are learning from examples that we give them about the kinds of people that we hire or that we parole or that we make other loan decisions for. Therefore, it's not so much a question of, is this machine perfect and does it have zero bias, because the alternative is almost always a biased human. And so I think the benchmark needs to be, can we do better than what we're doing currently? And in most cases, I think the answer is yes. If the machine algorithm is designed correctly, we can simultaneously reduce bias and also get more accuracy. In fact, there's nice research done on this by people like Sendhil Mullainathan and Jonathan Kleinberg and others that looked at parole decisions and found that you could reduce racial disparities at the same time having less recidivism and fewer people not getting parole. So you actually did better on all dimensions simultaneously because the algorithm was more accurate, and you can tune it. The other thing you have to remember is that these systems can be continuously improved. You can do what some of my friends at the MIT Media Lab call the Turing box, where you have a set of inputs and a set of outputs, and you can see how the different groups are affected, different data sets. You can put through hundreds, thousands, even millions of examples to see what the pattern is. So this is a concern that we need to be paying attention to, and if with effort we can continue to improve it. But I sometimes worry that the implicit or even explicit benchmark is perfection, zero bias. And I don't think that is ever or is rarely going to be attainable. In fact, there's some theorems that suggest that different kinds of biases, at least one of them is going to be in the data set. If you eliminate false positives, you're going to have more false negatives and so forth. So that's not the benchmark that we should be aiming at. The benchmark should be, can we do better than what we're doing currently? And can we build up systems that allow us to continuously get closer and closer to a more accurate and less biased system?
I have a question from back here.
Great. So my question is around national character and values and meaning. And I don't know, I'm not sure you're going to convince me that we're going to be able to retrain our way out of this. I feel like the rate of change is just too much. And so my question is really, what people do for their jobs is such an important part of our identity in America. Where is that sense of meaning and purpose going to come from if the robots are doing everything? I read Race Against the Machine my senior year in college.
Okay.
It shook me a little bit because I don't know. And it would be great to hear your guys' thoughts.
Right. Well, let me start on that one, and maybe others. I share your concern. I mean, that's why I wrote the book and with Andrew McAfee. but I also want to, temper it, just as I did a little bit maybe on the bias, that we're far from artificial and general intelligence that can do everything. And there are so many tasks that humans can do better that I don't see, and I talk to my smarter friends doing work in artificial intelligence, and they don't see that machines will be able to do many of the tasks that humans do right now for 10, 20, 30 years or more. So and those tasks need to be done. We want them to be done. Some of them, whether it's childcare and healthcare, may not be paid very well now. We could do things to pay them better. We'll have a bigger pie with the resources. Others involve a lot of creative work, scientific discovery, entrepreneurship, caring, persuasion, the arts. There are lots of them that we want to have done in our society. So I don't think that we're going to be running out of work, running out of problems that require human labor. I think what we will be doing is needing to refocus and restructure people. That's the big challenge for the next 20, 30 years, and that's where I'd like to focus our efforts. And I agree, we should understand that work is a source of meaning for a lot of people. And so the movement to sort of write checks for basic income and say, you know what, there's nothing we can think of for you to do. Why don't you just sit back and collect a check? I don't think that is the right solution for society because, as I said, there's problems that need human labor, and I don't think it's, for most people, something that leads them to have fulfillment and have happiness, and so it's not good for them either. For at least for the next few decades, having people work on those problems where humans have a comparative advantage is going to be the path forward.
Thanks. I'd like to sort of build on that question a little bit, if I might. Even as productivity has stagnated over the last 15 years, these technologies that we've seen, everything from Facebook to Twitter to Slack, have meant that work has become sort of ever more invasive in our lives, and to your point, ever more sort of present, even though it may not be giving us the actual sense of fulfillment that we would hope for and that we really strive for as human beings. How do we, how over the next decade, 2 decades, do you see technology changing so that we can have a healthier work-life balance, for sort of lack of a better term, and how do we adjust the culture of work moving forward, particularly as relates to the jobs that you've mentioned becoming more prominent, being coded in certain ways historically and perhaps not aligning with traditional, at least American perceptions of work?
I hope you've all seen Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, by the way.
Is that for you? Question?
I don't know if that question was for me, but I do think that I think this is a story that's in some ways as old as humankind. I mean, we have faced big technological changes before. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was pretty disruptive, as I recall. And one question I actually have for my colleagues on the panel here, if I could just use that prerogative. I remind my students what happened in the 18th century when people were being pulled into factories, visions of Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times, being caught in the gears. And, in those days, the workers were coming right out of the fields. Many of them were farmers. And a lot of them wore wooden shoes. And the name for those shoes, they were called the sabots, a French word for the wooden shoes. And you know what the workers did? They took off their shoes, their wooden shoes, and they threw it into the gears in the factories, and it's called sabotage. Yeah. So I'm wondering if we're looking at, I do you sabotage AI? I mean, are we going to see that kind of reaction? You can't throw a wooden shoe into an algorithm, can you?
You can. I mean, there are people who are seeing that, and I think that question and that answer, get at the fact that the technology is not going to decide how we organize our workplace. We will decide. Managers will decide. Voters will decide. Saboteurs may decide. Depending on how bad it gets. So. This is something we need to be actively engaged in. The same technology can be used to create more leisure, have more work-life balance, have shorter work weeks, and more broadly shared prosperity, or it can be used to concentrate wealth, to de-skill a lot of people. It depends on some of the choices we make. In the Industrial Revolution, there were some periods really bad. Charlie Chaplin, there's Charles Dickens, wrote about this even earlier. Right. And there were decades of stagnating incomes, but eventually, led in the United States, we invented, mass public education. It was a heretical idea that Europeans thought Americans were crazy to do that kind of thing, and all sorts of other rules, Social Security, and income taxes, and lots of other things, antitrust, that we put in place, child labor laws, to try to restrain and modify the way work was done. And a lot of decisions were made culturally as well, shorter work weeks, weekends off, and so forth. There's a set of changes that we can make going forward if we want to, that would change the way work is being done. And that's a debate that we all have. Part of it's political, a lot of it is done inside of different companies, a lot of it's done by each individual deciding how they want to allocate their time.
I'm just going to answer this by saying there's so many benefits you get from the technology. I mentioned productivity because it makes people better off. It's the way we raise our standard of living. So that's not the only thing, of course. There are other things. And of course, technology can come on very quickly. I mean, Uber and Lyft is driving people out of business. Let's face it, right? When you choose to take Uber or Lyft, you're not taking that limousine service or that taxi service. So it has effects. So that what you want to do is have a society that's flexible, and is a safety net, and we genuinely care about people in the adjustment. International trade can throw people for a loop too. Agriculture used to be 50% of this country in terms of employment. It's now less than 5%. Yeah. It's just remarkable how a flexible system can handle that. Mm-hmm. Also, there's just genuine advantages of the markets. Discrimination. Gary Becker was here for many years. Mm-hmm. He argued that a more competitive markets where firms maximize profits will help to drive out discrimination. Doesn't make sense to hire someone who's less productive. It reduces your profits. It's a stupid thing to do. So there's so many things to do that take advantage of the market system. You have to worry about externalities and monopoly power and things like that. But I worry sometimes we're going to say this is a new world. It's completely different. Well, it is new in many respects, but there's a lot of strategies and rules that still work for policy.
It's really a good time to think about how do we upgrade some of our social structures so that it pairs better with the economy that is to come, right? I mean, you talked about some of those social structures evolving. But for example, we can see moving ahead, first, in the last recession, one of the things that happened, according to the workforce economists, was that work became decoupled from the number of workers. So productivity for companies actually stayed constant, even though companies reduce workers, right? And before that, if you reduce worker, you usually lowered in productivity. Well, that didn't happen in the last recession. So the dynamics are changing thanks to technology. What we could do is we could look ahead and in some of these high productivity area and gains in technology, what does it do to the worker? What does it do to communities? And are there ways that we can stabilize? So let me do an extreme, because in the area of the future world may be one where we have more self-employment. And for those, what we're seeing is that work is becoming more fragmented, and so that you can parse out work and be able to secure very high-end professionals to be able to do parts of work and then paste together that work in order to get your project done. So in that type of economy, how do you still bring stability to the individual? Because the technology is getting smart enough where they're beginning to optimize. For example, you have to call in, Joe, you have to call in and say, how many hours do I have? Well, Joe, today you get to work 4 to 6 based on the weather pattern and the traffic condition. And tomorrow you work 9 to 12 o'clock. And if you can imagine what that does to our communities and our family and the fragility it creates, that is not a future that we want, but we can actually begin thinking through what's the design of social structures that we need to put in place to give stability to some of these, your childcare, your benefits. You know, we talked about portable benefits. Some of these things we need in place as the economy and the nature of work changes, so that we don't introduce fragility with innovation. We keep the innovation without introducing the fragility.
Thank you very much. I appreciated some of the historical references to the Industrial Revolution and past technological change. And I wanted to see if we could look at the comparison between, let's say, oil becoming an important resource and now data and knowledge about people and their behavior becoming the sort of resource, and ask the question, do you think that data has become, and which drives machine learning and algorithms and all the things that drive new economic processes, has become so concentrated that it is now anti-competitive, that there's so few companies holding so much data about so many people? And if so, Professor Taylor's referred a few times to antitrust regulation. Is antitrust the way to remedy this anti-competitive bias, or are there things short of breaking up big tech that you think should be considered to bring the market back into a competitive balance?
I think you're absolutely right that data is a very novel form of currency. Just revisiting one of the conversations that we had earlier today, if we look at the market of social media, which I'd consider a silo of the consumer internet, one of the industries within the consumer internet industry, it's essentially controlled by Facebook in this country through Instagram and Facebook. And when I say control, I mean over 99% of posts, let's say, or users are using these two platforms. And really the stranglehold on that market that this company, which I used to work for, has established, enables them to really collect currency in that market, I believe, at monopoly rates. And the currency, as you mentioned, it's not a traditional commodity. It's data, or it's a combination of data and attention, data and time of the consumer. It's not oil or money or gold or something like that. And they extract it at a monopoly rent and convert it into dollars through the digital advertising market when P&G tries to advertise on Facebook or anyone who wants to participate in that market. And so I do think that, and by the way, if you look at that market of social media, it's many people. I think it's debatable, but many people have argued Facebook is exhibiting what's called monopoly leveraging. It is using its monopoly or pseudo-monopolistic status to exclude other players from that market by either shutting them out or spying on them or competing with them with the tremendous existing power that they already have, doing all sorts of things to try to push other players out of the market or simply acquire them. And so, yes, I think there's a competition problem, and you can extend this analogy to e-commerce or search or online video sharing or internet-based text messaging, each of which Facebook or Google or Amazon dominates. So what do we do about it? I think this is a really difficult question, and there's an open debate about this right now. But traditionally, when you have this kind of a competition problem, you ask, first of all, well, is there competition in this market? Here, the answer, let's just assume for a second, is no. If the answer is no, then you ask, well, if there isn't competition, could we foresee a dynamic and vibrant ecosystem of lots of companies in this market someday if we apply pro-competition policies? If the answer, again, is no, then what you're really saying is that, well, these companies are essentially natural monopolies. You can't see multiple railroads. You can't see multiple telecommunications networks. You can't see, in other words, social media or these internet companies are natural monopolies. And if they're natural monopolies, then you would then apply some kind of a public utility regime to protect against, let's say, capitalistic or monopolistic overreach. If it's the latter, if you could see a cop on the beat, like the Federal Trade Commission or the Justice Department or the European Commission, actually say, no, if you're exceeding 35% of the market, we're gonna shut you off. Then, or more broadly, that if you can apply pro-competition policies and foresee a vibrant market, then that's where you would apply the Elizabeth Warren policy, which is to break up these companies, which is the extreme pro-competition policy. You could also just have an agency that better polices the industry, a more resourced Federal Trade Commission, for example, a more resourced Justice Department, better industrial auditing against protecting consumers from anti-competitive behavior. I think it's an open conversation. I think these companies are, some economists would claim they're actually tending toward natural monopoly. I would think that is true, actually, or at least they definitely exhibit some behavior in that respect. So, but again, it is an open conversation for sure.
So I just add, I think you need to have some facts. We price marginal cost. Where's the price? What is the marginal cost? What is the monopoly power? Why is this like an electric utility where we regulate the price? But even we're finding there is regulating cable TV is shown to be kind of crazy to do very quickly because the technology changes so fast. So I'd be very careful about this. We have pretty good ways to determine what industries should be regulated, what industries should be broken up because with antitrust policies. I don't see why they're not working. I think to some extent, what's not stated enough here, I think, is the way that businesses, little teeny firms, startup firms, individual consumers who are actually doing business, use these platforms to start up. They're advertising. A poor guy in Africa starts a firm, a woman starts a grocery store, and they use these platforms. It's incredibly powerful. That's more on the business to business or business to consumer rather than consumer to consumer. So I think we need to be very careful about this and not just use words like too much power, capitalism is bad. That is not the answer. The answer is what is it that you don't like about power of capitalism? I think it's good to make profits. What's wrong with making profits? That's what capitalism is all about. So profits are fine. You don't want to have monopoly power. You don't want price gouging or whatever happens, but profits are a good measure of value added.
John D. Rockefeller was a good Baptist, and he had a sign over his office door which said, "Competition is a sin."
Okay. All right, we're running short on time, but there's a question right here. There's a microphone coming.
I'm a technologist, and I'm looking at the title of this panel, and it's called Emerging Technology. And most of the conversation is about technology that has already emerged. It's either in the morning or it's at noontime, and it's got a way to go. But there's been a lot of dystopian comments on this panel, and not too many utopian comments except from Eric. I wonder if, and this is addressed to all the panelists, but Eric in particular, because he has looked at a tremendous amount of data having to do with jobs. When you looked at all that data about jobs from the sort of lower level, less educated jobs up to the bachelor's degree and beyond jobs, including the middle, are there any brand new technologies that occur to you that we ought to invent? And for all of the rest of you, are there any brand new technologies that you would like? Because that's my job, right? You don't want to put me out of work. So I'm looking for suggestions of new technologies that are at the dawn, or even the dawn hasn't even occurred yet.
Well, thanks for all your contributions to the field, first off. I mean, none of this would have been happening if people like you hadn't been contributing to artificial intelligence and inspiring generations of people to go into it. New things to invent. Well, let me go meta on you and talk about the things that some guys at DeepMind and elsewhere are doing, which is using artificial intelligence to help with scientific discovery and technologies that help scientists do better discovery. Is really, really hard. It's one of the things I would put on my list of things that right now machines are very bad at and humans are pretty good at. But there is work being done to have AI, for a while they've been trying to do things like theorem proving, but also protein folding and identify ways that you can predict how a sequence of DNA will lead to a particular type of protein and how that's going to fold. And other areas that ultimately could do a lot for our health and eliminate many classes of disease, curing cancer, and making new kinds of scientific discoveries. So that's something that I think some of the most inspired work in artificial intelligence is not on figuring out how to get people to click on ads more effectively. That's a big industry, one of the most profitable ones right now. But I think one of the ones that's attracting some of the brightest minds is in scientific discovery, especially in medicine and biology.
So I think it's a very good question. I do like monetary economics and macroeconomics, and I look back at this terrible Great Recession we had, 2007, 8, 9, and just a few years before that, in the early 80s, just a terrible unemployment skyrocketing. And a few weeks ago, I watched the movie Apollo 11, the documentary where they have films from that era. President Kennedy says, we're going to put a man on the moon and get him back, a man on the moon and get him back. And then 1969, you have Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the moon, and it's phenomenal what they were able to put together. Why can't we do that in monetary economics so we don't have these terrible recessions and things? That's what I dream of. We could somehow make a smoother economy. Of course, it's great. Growth is great, and that's not, but we're missing a few things. That'd be nice to have them. Maybe it's blockchain, and it'll do it.
I have a wish list, and I wish this area of technology would evolve a lot faster, and it's in the area of immersive social virtual reality. So virtual reality is now no longer just for your teenagers and your kids to play video games. But there is a frontier of being able to enter, like could you enter the virtual realm and actually begin to hack learning. So for example, if I entered into the virtual world as my teenage version of myself, could I actually learn technology faster because my self-identity is different? So the tools are too immature right now, but we're beginning to see little sparks of being able to understand that there may be something different in terms of being able to comprehend longer, retain longer, as well as acquire more knowledge faster. And so there needs to be a whole body of research on this area.
Why don't we go back here? Maybe one last question.
A question mostly related to the community colleges, although a little bit all bricks and mortar educational institutions. You mentioned, Van, as the value proposition, or a big part of the value proposition for community colleges is the open admission, the affordability, and the geographic proximity to their customers. It seems like online education has that trumped on every metric. How do you see online education and community colleges specifically competing or partnering in the future?
So it goes back to this question about data and the use of data. Traditionally, we have taken data for the purpose of looking backwards, which is reporting on how did people do, right? How did the students do? Currently, we're in the place where we're looking at data using data for the purpose of continuous improvements, where to invest in actions. The future is one where data is going to be for personalization. So if you could, just this last year, my family stayed at a hotel in San Francisco for a wedding, and my 2 teenagers and I and my husband, for the first time, we actually checked into a hotel room, did not turn on the TV at all, but all 4 of us were being entertained. It was either Prime or Netflix or YouTube, et cetera, right? So the personalization that we're all experiencing right now with other venues like Prime and Netflix is now going to translate into higher education, where you're going to want some set of personalization of your experience based on your background or a certain set of variables. That is a complete challenge to physical institutions, because the technology and the data backbone of most higher education institutions wasn't set up for that purpose. And so those universities or colleges that were digital first versus physical first will have an advantage in terms of that data backbone. So it's going to be a bit of a catch-up game for all of higher education to evolve, to get to a place where you can begin sort of that digital first experience, have it personalized, have a lot of nudges and prompts, and then also be able to, over a lifetime, to be able to combine different types of specializations, bundle and unbundle all types of education, because we're going to need to keep that up in order to be marketable in the next economy. So it's going to be a challenge for higher ed to evolve.
But the Stanford campus will still be a very special place.
Stanford will be special.
Well, thank you, everyone. Let's take a moment to thank our panelists and also our audience for a quick questions. Well, that was good. Yeah. It was nice to meet you and talk to you.